Good morning. Good morning. How is everybody this morning? We're going to go ahead and get started here in just a minute. So if you can make your way to your seats, we're going to stay pretty strict to time just because the General has a very large fundraiser that he needs to go to here in just a little bit. But we're glad that he's here to be with you all. My name is Reverend Jeff Beakley. I'm the campus minister here at Tech Wesley. We know how important peace is in the world, and we have focused on wanting to understand more about the war that's going on in Ukraine. And we were fortunate enough through one of our students, Abby, raise your hand, was able to make contact with General Breedlove and have him come here and be able to speak, because he's a former NATO Supreme Commander in Europe. And so to have a four-star, sorry.
Devoted already.
A four-star general to be here is pretty amazing. He is a part-time professor here at Georgia Tech, so you need to enroll for his class if you want to take that. But he also graduated from Georgia Tech in 1977. And
I'm really old.
Yes, civil engineering, and he has 2 grandchildren, and it's just great that he's able to be here with us. So let's give General Breedlove a very warm welcome.
So the Reverend gave away my 2 qualifications. I always stand in front of a group at Georgia Tech and say 2 things qualify me to be here. 1, I got out in '77, civil engineer. I went on to get an aeronautical engineering master's, and then I went to MIT for post-master's work at MIT for a year in a fellowship. But my life never really was as an engineer. I went into the Air Force, served for 39 years. I flew the F-16 for 24 of those years. And then I started becoming a more and more senior commander. And as was introduced, in the end, I was the commander of NATO. The actual title is SACEUR. I was the 17th SACEUR. Anyone know who the first SACEUR was? Dwight D. Eisenhower, who went on to be president, was the first SACEUR. He led the landing force in Europe in World War II and then started the organization that was eventually known as NATO. The Reverend also stole a little bit of my thunder in that I would like to ask you to consider, here at Georgia Tech, we think in the fall, we're going to start teaching a course called Peace Engineering. And it's all about avoiding this. It's all about how we take the engineering principles and add those to liberal arts principles in humanities and try to use the strengths of engineering and the strengths of the humanities to avoid war if war starts, to dampen the effects of war, and if we can't dampen the effects of war, then to recover from war. And it's bigger than war. One of the first things we've worked on in peace engineering with the groups here at Tech is gun control and gun violence. And we are now taking on Ukraine, just some small parts of Ukraine, and we're going to start working a federally funded research effort right here at Georgia Tech in what's called peace engineering. We hope to offer minors starting next year. It'll probably be a couple of years before we actually offer an undergraduate degree in peace engineering, but I would ask you to ask me about it sometime if you can. Today we want to get on with this. I'm going to run through these slides because I have to leave at 45. I'm going to stop talking before 30 after and try to save the last 15 or 20 minutes for you to ask questions. And you can ask questions about anything but politics. I do not do politics. I have testified 6 times. I testified 21 times in the service. I've testified 6 times after I've retired. I was invited 3 times by Republicans and 3 times by Democrats. I like to keep a voice to both sides of the aisle, so I don't dabble in politics. You ask me a political question, I'm going to reorient your question and answer it the way I want to answer it. So just as a warning, I don't do politics. So my title is Russia, Ukraine, Phase 2, ? Why would I have the question mark up there? I think that this is what the world, and specifically what Russia, wants you to think, that this is phase 2. I was in Ukraine 8 days before the war started. I have already known President Zelensky since before the war, and I and a small team were over there to meet with President Zelensky, his defense leadership, and we met with essentially their congressional leadership. They call it the Rada. We met with the majority party and the 3 minority parties in the Rada to talk about how this war was going to move forward. While we were there, President Zelensky was really pretty angry with the West in general. And I don't have time to ask you questions. That's how I usually do it. So I'm going to ask a question and then I'm going to answer it. Why was Mr. Zelensky, President Zelensky, angry with the West? If you remember what we were doing in the lead up to this war, every day on the news, it was 50,000 troops on the border. And then the next day, it was 60,000 troops on the border. And then the next day, it was 90,000 troops on the border. And everybody in the West was focused on the Russian buildup on the border. And the President Zelensky was angry because what he said is, you are not watching what's going on in my country right now. The bombings, the sabotage, the cyber attacks, threatening schools, threatening kindergartens, threatening school buses, all the things that Russia was doing inside Ukraine. Phase 1 of the war had already started to him in his country. So if President Zelensky was drawing this slide, he would say phase 3 because the world was not paying attention to the gray zone, the hybrid war that was already on in Ukraine, while we on CNN and Fox and everything was so focused on the buildup of the troops, we weren't watching what Russia was already doing inside of Ukraine. So phase 2, question mark. When you get to be a general, you're used to saying, next slide. Now I have to do it myself. Hopefully it's going to work. Let me try this. I'm reasonably proficient this way. Nope. Nope. Help. The fighter pilot has run out of options. Okay. So where are we now? This is not going to be a briefing about tanks and airplanes and all of that. I want you to get a feel for what's happening in this country right now, where we are in this war, because it's changed. If you remember, in the beginning of this fight, there was a lot of Russian force up around Kyiv. There was an entry coming in from the northwest out of Belarus. There was an entry coming out of the northeast from Russia and the edge of Belarus, and that was a mass of force around Kyiv. Well, the Russians lost the Battle of Kyiv. They lost a very strategic battle, and that was their number one objective. And so now what we see, and you've heard about it in the news, is that all of that force up and around Kyiv that was defeated went back into Belarus, moved back to the east, was refitted, refurbished, resupplied, added men, added equipment, and now that force has moved down over here on the east side of Ukraine. And what I want to talk about here is now you see the trace of the battle, and you can see where just the day before yesterday all of the strikes and the fighting was in that area, marked by those little fires. Essentially now, in the beginning of this war, Russia came in totally unprepared. They thought they were going to have a very short war, that Ukraine was going to welcome them with open arms. 4 of their major units didn't pack combat gear in their backpacks. They packed their dress uniforms for the parade that they expected to be in 4 days into this war. And so Russia came in totally unprepared. And that's kind of why they really got a shellacking, okay? Because their preparation, their logistical supply, and their planning was completely wrong. Now what we know is they have gone out, refit, refurbished, and come back. Things that they have corrected. They now unity of command. There was no commander in the north. There was essentially 31 battalion tactical groups independently operating in the north. And that is no way to run a war. And so now they have one commander. You've heard about him on the news. He's a particularly brutal man that ran the Syrian campaign for Russia. And if you're familiar at all of what happened in the part of what this means for Ukraine. And now what we see is a much more disciplined approach. The Russians are back to what they call probing and shaping. In Warsaw Pact days, the Russians would do this probing and shaping exactly like we see going on. And when they sense a weak point, then they mass forces and drive through the weak point. So what we expect now is all of this is happening so that Russia can identify the weak point, and then the armored thrust will come through the weak point. So the sad news is, while we saw complete confusion and lack of command in the north, now we see a completely changed complexion by this force in attacking in the way that Soviet armies have fought through history. We see that discipline now being brought in the east. Essentially now in the east, we see 76 battalion task groups. There is no way of putting a number of people on that, because every one of those battalions is like we used to say, a purposely made Dutch shoe. Each one is carved in a different way. So different numbers of men, cannons, tanks, and all of that. But essentially 76 battalions, and they didn't bring their Air Force really to the northern fight. Again, they expected to be having a parade in 3 days. They didn't take it very seriously. But now in the east, they've got their Air Force there, both their rotary wing and fixed wing Air Force, to support their forces. It's about 300 miles from Kharkiv in the north down to the north of Crimea in the south. And of course, you're very familiar with what's going on in Mariupol, which is the port right here, where the holdout in the steel mill is still fighting, but the rest of the town of Mariupol has fallen. Next slide, please. All right, this is not for you to see every one of these blotches. This is to show you the extent of the Russian effort. Russia now failed in the north. They have been embarrassed on a global scale. They do not intend to fail in the south. And so, again, what you see, all this red circled around, the primary piece of the Ukrainian battlefront is right in the middle, and all of that is Russia. And of note, there is one major prize that Russia has not made a very tough attempt to get yet. Anybody got a guess? Have you heard of the town of Odessa? Odessa is way down here in the southwest. So 5 years ago, or no, it's longer than that now. 10 years ago, Ukraine had 3 major ports. Mariupol and Odessa were the primary commercial ports where grain and all of that breadbasket stuff went out through Mariupol, and all of their industrial production went out through Odessa. And then Sevastopol, which is in Crimea, was their military port. So Ukraine had 3 major ports. And for you civil engineers, if there's any out there, all of the roads, railroads, bridges, and infrastructure led to Mariupol and Odessa in order to move the economy of Ukraine out. And Ukraine supplies most of the grain supplies for this part of the Black Sea, for Turkey, and for Egypt and other areas in northern Africa. Almost 100% of their grain in those countries comes from Ukraine. So in 14, we lost Sevastopol to the first 2 invasions of Ukraine by Russia in 2014. Now we've lost Mariupol, and if Odessa falls, then Ukraine is a landlocked nation. And the estimates is if it becomes a landlocked nation and can't ship by sea, it's a 25% reduction in GDP. Think about that. 25% reduction in GDP. And that's what Russia's trying to do now. They want to close out Ukraine. They want to so severely impact their economy that the government falls, and then Russia puts in its own government, its own cronies, and we're back to the old days. Next slide, please. So here, what are the new strategic objectives? The first strategic objective 52 days ago was take Kyiv, kill or remove Zelensky, install Russian government in Ukraine. The attack on Kyiv failed. So now they've set a new series of objectives. This is Phil Breedlove's rendition of what I read in the Russian press and in the U.S. press. The first one is to continue the land bridge. This is Crimea. And Crimea, even though it's a peninsula out in the middle of the Black Sea, is a very arid peninsula, completely dependent on the north in Ukraine for water. And so what did Ukraine do when Russia invaded and occupied Crimea? Is they cut the water off. And so Crimea has been struggling for water supply for about 6 years. And so the first objective of this land bridge is to come down and take the area above Crimea up around the town of Kherson, which is inappropriately pronounced on the TV Kherson. But in the vicinity of Kherson is where that water supply is, and essentially they tap into the Dnieper River. If you're familiar, it's not on the map, sadly. The Dnieper River runs and cuts Ukraine in half. And in a couple of places, the Dnieper River is wider than some of our Great Lakes. This is a monster river. And so it is a very big barrier. The second strategic objective is, like I mentioned, to move all the way to Odessa, to landlock Ukraine, and as I have up there, to significantly impact the economy of Ukraine and thereby force the capitulation of the government, install the Russian government, and now we're back to cronyism like we were before. And then finally, the last thing is, in the eyes of the world, Mr. Putin's probably never going to be able to change it, but he has got to manufacture a victory for his internal audience. And he had a strategic defeat in Kyiv. And so now he needs to show something in the South that he can go tell his population that this is a victory. Does anybody know approximately how many people we lost in the 18 plus years we were in Afghanistan off and on? Anybody know that number? It's roughly 3,000, okay? In Ukraine, in the first month, Russia has lost, we believe conservatively, about 16,500. So 19 years, we lost 3,000 in Afghanistan. In 1 month, he's lost, some people say 21,000. I don't believe it. I believe the better number is 16,500. But still, 16,500 in 1 month. He's going to have a real problem when he has to go home and tell all those families that their sons, brothers, and fathers are not coming home. And so he needs a victory in the South, and he needs to be able to tell the Russian people that we defeated the Nazis and we defeated the Americans in Ukraine, and your sons and brothers and fathers were heroes in that fight. And so now he's got to find a victory in the South. Next slide, please. Now, a scary part. Mr. Putin desperately wants Ukraine. If you've read his 5,000-word article that he wrote about now 3 months ago, he talks about there is no country of Ukraine. There is the Ukraine, which is a part of Russia, sort of like the South is a part of America, or the North is a part of America. That's the way he sees Ukraine. And if you read the last two papers that he sent us 12 days before the war started, he called them draft treaties or draft agreements. He sent us two papers. They're very short, and they set out certain things that the West must do. And in his words, next slide, please. In his words, he said, sign these or there will be other measures. We now know what other measures means because we didn't sign them and he invaded. So what do these two documents talk about? Essentially, they are draft treaties and they are demands of the West. And if I could give you a visual in your mind, they essentially reinstate the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union. So he said, all these border states that are around me, you now need to move all weapons out of those border states. You need to move most of NATO out and further back in those border states, and you need to move the United States out of those border states. So if the weapons are gone, NATO has moved back, and America's gone, what do you think he has in plan for those border states? Okay? It doesn't take a rocket scientist or an aeronautical engineer to figure that out. Okay? So he essentially made demands in these two documents that, in my mind, restructures, completely changes the security architecture of Europe and reinstates his ability to establish a Warsaw Pact / Soviet Union arrangement again. These last two statements are Phil Breedlove and Phil Breedlove alone. These are things I believe, and there are a lot of people that believe the same thing. In 2008, when Russia invaded Georgia, we thought this was an I didn't, but the West aberration. It's not the real Russia. We'll get past this. We'll get back to peacemaking with Russia. What we know now is Russia was using all the time that we were taking peace dividends to build their army and prepare for what we see now. So in 2008, he invaded Georgia, and as you know, he remains and holds 20% of the nation of Georgia in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. About 20% of that nation is occupied by Russia. In 2008, we sanctioned him. In 2014, he invaded Ukraine twice. He invaded and occupied the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea, and he still occupies it. And he invaded the Donbass. And in Ukraine, what we call a state, they call an oblast. And the two oblasts of Lugansk and Donetsk, they hold now about 50% of those two oblasts. In 2014, we sanctioned him. In 2022, he lined up, depending on who you believe, between 190 and 220,000 troops on the Ukrainian border, and we threatened to sanction him again. And we told him what the sanctions were going to be. Our president said, I explained them explicitly to Mr. Putin. He knows what he's going to get if he comes across the border. And Mr. Putin took a look at those sanctions, I can hack that, and came across the border. So essentially, 3 times in dealing with Russia invading other nations, we have given him sanctions. Here is what I see. Sanctions have hurt Russia. Sanctions have hurt the Russian people, and sanctions have hurt the Russian economy. But sanctions have never, nor will they ever, change Mr. Putin's actions. Mr. Putin is prepared to sacrifice the Russian people to meet his objectives for Ukraine and for the rest of Europe. And so sanctions are never going to change Mr. Putin's mind. Now, I will tell you that the sanctions we're putting on them right now are so tough. They, again, will not change Mr. Putin's actions, but we're starting to see the people around him fray. Some of the oligarchs are starting to rebel and kick back. And so, wonder of all wonders, maybe it will get so bad that the people will remove Mr. Putin. But I will bet any one of you, Chili Slaw Dog at the varsity, that Mr. Putin will never change his actions based on sanctions. He is prepared to sacrifice the Russian people in order to move forward with his goals. Next slide. Now I just want to make one editorial comment. This is Valery Gerasimov. I used to talk to him once a month. We would have a VTC and talk through interpreters, of course. And then he invaded Ukraine on watch, commanding NATO. And both the NATO command and my U.S. command said no more talking to Mr. Gerasimov. But he is the leader of the Russian forces. And he said this several years ago. And what he was really talking about, this is not academically correct, but I use it to make a point. He was talking about what the Russians call gray zone war, or actually we call it gray zone war. Mr. Putin calls it asymmetric means, indirect methods. In other words, it's fighting in all the things like cyber, information, all of that stuff, and not fighting with guns and bullets. So he said war has changed. I'm here to tell you that war has changed. If you go back and you study what happened in Grozny, in his fight in Chechnya, and if you go back and look at what happened in eastern Syria, when Russia is unable to beat an opponent's military, Russia takes the fight to the people, to the civilians. Grozny, the town of Grozny, was leveled, unrecognizable when they left. Syria, eastern Syria, Aleppo and other places, leveled. They couldn't rout out the bad guys, so they just leveled the town. Irrespective, that's not a real word, but I still use it, irrespective of the civilians that became involved, they leveled it. And what we see now, and if you've seen the pictures from Bucha, is we're going to see this in almost every town as the Russians leave it in northern Ukraine. So I would tell you that I agree with Mr. Gerasimov. I think that Russia has adopted the most criminal and inhumane way of war in modern history. And we're going to see more of it in Ukraine, sadly, in my opinion. Next. So, I testified recently in front of a joint session of Congress to both the House and the Senate. And in that, an individual asked me, I said the same thing. We keep sanctioning Mr. Putin and it hasn't changed anything. And they asked me a bunch of questions, and this is how I answered it. I said, if we reward bad behavior, meaning allow them to get away with it, or if we allow bad behavior to stand, we're going to get more bad behavior. We got a beautiful little, 1.5, 2-year-old running around here. She's out there. So one of the things that I learned in raising my 3 children, who are amazing, is little kids. If you let them get away with stuff, or if you reward them for stuff, they're going to do more bad stuff. And that's just exactly Mr. Putin. So somewhere we've got to draw the line. In Ukraine, I think it's going to be easy to draw the line because Russia's actions in Ukraine, we have a French team in there investigating now, and they have clearly labeled their actions in Bucha as criminal, and they are now starting to use the word genocidal. So we have to hold Mr. Putin accountable for what he's doing. Now, talking to our country. Again, I am not political, but for several administrations from the left and the right, we are tending towards isolationism in America. That's absolutely wrong. We need to be a part of the world. We need to be a part of a force that leads people to a place where we believe values are and human worth are valuable. And this is my own statement here in the last. What's going on in Ukraine now? If we don't respond, we're going to see a lot more of it in our future. And that's all I have to say. So who's got the first question? Yes, sir. So this is a great question. Let me tell you one thing that's going to happen here, and if you gave a dime, that would be awesome. So we have Ukrainian students here at this school who are now lost. They don't know where their parents are. They don't know if their parents are alive. They don't know where their next dorm check is coming from. They don't know where to go if they were going to go home anywhere. And they're just drifting. And frankly, we also have some Russian students that are that way. And we're not going to hold what their nation is doing against them. So I'm a part of a group. In fact, I'm going to be talking to a big group of big check writers after this. And what we're doing here at Georgia Tech is two things. Our school is started a fund, and we are raising money to take care of these Ukrainian students. There's Ukrainian students in Ukraine who have been separated from their parents, and they don't have any idea what's next, but they're already accepted into next fall's freshman class. And we got Ukrainian students on the campus and some Russian students on the campus who have no idea what's happening now. And we are raising money to take care of those folks. And I think making that aware, talking to alumni and saying, are you aware we're trying to help, and getting that word out, that'd be a great first start. Second one is, don't listen to me. Do your own research. If you want to come talk to me, I'm in the Sam Nunn School and I'll talk to you. But if you do your own research, and if you find what's happening in Ukraine is wrong, speak out. Don't be quiet. Make sure people understand that you don't stand for this. The other thing we're doing here at Georgia Tech, the civil engineering societies in the United States have been looking at the pictures on the TV of Ukraine. The country is demolished. Their water systems are not working. Their power systems are not working. Their sanitary systems are not working. Their bridges are destroyed, and much of their roads are destroyed. So the civil engineering schools in America, led, I believe, by ASCE, the American Society of Civil Engineers, they have started an effort to educate 2,000 Ukrainian civil engineers and send them home to rebuild their country, wearing that on their chest. And we're raising money for that as well, because here at Georgia Tech, we're taking on training 200 of those students. So we're going to bring them here. We're going to educate the great bulk of them in a 4-year degree. We're going to educate about 8 or 9 of them in a master's degree, and we're going to educate 1 or 2 in PhD level, and we're sending them back to Ukraine. And we're going to pay for it all. I have a scholarship fund that I give, and I've switched it now to this Ukraine piece. And that's another thing. If you want to talk it up and say, help us support Ukraine by training Georgia Tech engineers to go back to that country and rebuild that country. And there will also be people in other schools, including the Sam Nunn School, that we're going to train and send back there. So thanks for the question. Back here, and then we'll go back there, and then there.
Can you define what you mean by the West must respond? Like in what ways?
So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out I'm a 39-year fighter pilot. And I believe that it is the atrocities I've seen in Bucha, it's time for the West to bring force against Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin has never changed anything he's ever done until he met force. And I think we need to start looking at options to say enough. So Mr. Obama took 500 Russians off the battlefield in northern Syria. He faced the same Putin and the same nukes. Robert F. Kennedy faced nukes in Cuba aimed at our country, and he did it. There are a series of presidents in history who have taken on Russia and their nukes, and it went okay. So my thought is, do not take counsel of your fears and take all options off the table. we need to examine all options. Back there.
What is some common misinformation you've heard, and how would you respond to it?
So right now, Mr. Putin's external misinformation is really clumsy. I mean, it's really clumsy because he's not worried about the external world. He doesn't care whether people in America believe him or not. He really doesn't. He used to, but he knows now that he's gone over the line so far that he's not going to sway us. Most of his misinformation is internal. And it's really interesting. One of the gentlemen I had dinner with last night at another donor party, he has grandparents from Ukraine, parents from Russia. I mean, his family is all mixed around. And he calls himself a Ukrainian. He's a 94 grad from here. And he calls himself Ukrainian. And he said, if I listen to my family from Ukraine talking to my family from Russia, it is crazy how much they disagree. In Russia, Mr. Putin has convinced, because remember that about 98% of Russians get their news from TV, and the Russian government controls all TV inside Russia. In Russia, almost everybody believes that truly they are fighting Nazis in Ukraine, and that America and the American CIA is running this war. And that's what Russians believe. And so there is a group of people in Russia that are, I call them the Joe and Sally six-packs of Russia. They completely buy this story. In fact, Mr. Putin's approval rating is pretty high. There is a thin layer of intelligentsia that have sort of risen above that in their educational and work experience. They know how to get on the internet despite what Russia does. They know how to use VPNs and other things. And they know what's happening in Ukraine. And those are the ones you're seeing in the streets and beginning to talk out. And then above them, there's two levels of oligarchs. They're the old oligarchs who have all their money, and Mr. Putin doesn't control their money. Their money's all around the world. And then there's a young group of oligarchs who are completely dependent on Mr. Putin for their money. And so you got the old oligarchs, like the gentleman 2 days ago, one of the richest men in Russia, speaking out against the war. And you got the young oligarchs carrying the tune of Putin like crazy. So the messages that we most want to fight are those internal messages. If the Russian people knew what Mr. Putin was doing, he would have a whole lot more problems in the street. And this is fast going to become a problem for him because at the end of May, the conscripts that he has fighting, the draftees that he has fighting, they're supposed to go home. And when they go home minus 16,000, and the people of Russia see how many people have died in Ukraine, and they were told they were going there for exercises, not to fight. When that happens, it's going to be a big problem. So, let's see. Was there one over here? Okay, right there, good.
So kind of going off of what you just said, something I've heard is that Russia has like an aging population and they don't have a lot of young men to fight in their army. How do you think that's going to impact Putin's strategy in this war?
He's having trouble right now raising next year's conscripts because they're gonna end up starting to have much more of the ethnic minorities from Russia being in their military. They've tried to keep it rather Slavic pure in the past. They're not going to be able to do that in the future. And so we'll see more of the ethnic minorities in there. Some that they have conquered who don't particularly like them but may be serving in their military, Chechens and others. There are Chechens that absolutely sign up to Russia, but there are Chechens still that don't. And so it is a problem. Anybody know where Russian male life expectancy is in the world? 5. Bad medicine, lots of vodka. Bottom 5. Who else? Yes, sir.
So what's the point? Why is he going to try and take a country that he's demolished? What does he get from it?
I have almost the same question you have. I cannot find a human reason for him doing what he's doing. One, it's pride. Two, he believes that's a part of Russia. And three, I really thought he thought this was going to be easy. Remember, 3 huge units didn't bring their chem gear and stuff that you normally carry in your backpack. 3 huge units came with parade uniforms. You know, so I think that he completely misjudged what was going on in Ukraine, and he thought this would be a walk in the park like Crimea was. And he got something very different than he expected.
You mentioned earlier that when Russia invaded Crimea, Ukraine cut the water off.
Yes.
Because it's an arid peninsula.
Mm-hmm.
Why would he expect that they would welcome him with open arms
Yeah.
in a parade after doing
There's
that?
so many weirdnesses here that you just can't. He has been in a crazy state for almost several months with these 40-foot-long tables. He doesn't let anybody get near him. You know, there's something going on there that it's all wild speculation, and I don't want to feed that speculation. But he's made some really bad decisions. Okay, I got to walk out the door. This is going to be the last question.
Thank you. And this was a great presentation. I guess what we're all wondering here, and I want to ask this, is can we really say that what they've been saying in the news about Putin's state of mind is actually true? What is your sort of like general idea on
Yeah,
like, Putin's state of mind?
I'm going to not satisfy you. This is so weird that I am not going to go out there and predict anything. He, in the past, he's been a little bit crazy, but I've always said he's sly like a fox. He plays us like a fiddle. The minute he wants something and he doesn't want the United States to bother him, he threatens nukes, threatens nukes, threatens nukes. The United States goes, whoa, how far back here can I get? And lets him do his thing. And so he gets away with it. But now it's just not quite right what's going on there, and I refuse to be a part of the rumor mill. But history will tell us why he did some of these incredibly irrational things, and it's kind of odd. I am so sorry. I really have to step out.
Okay, thank you so much for
thank
coming. Yes, thank you. Even though the general is leaving, our session hasn't ended completely, so thank you so much for coming.
This is the way we used to do it. Go Jackets, to hell with Georgia.
Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to talk just briefly about things that students can do. The general spoke about how fundraising is a big component. That's where he's leaving right now. But for you as students who maybe don't have money to give, what can you do? Well, one, you can educate yourself, right? You could be part of getting the word out around this. The next thing that you can do, and I would be remiss not to say this as a ministry, is that you can pray. And one of the things that we're going to do here in just a minute, the official speaking of the general is now over, and we will turn off the live stream. But we're going to spend some time on a multi-faith perspective, not just Christianity, not just Muslim, not just all the world religions. We're just going to pray for peace. And so I'll ask that we turn off the live stream.